She would curl up in my arms after panic attacks, whispering that I was the only person who made her feel safe in the world. 2 years later, she's telling mutual friends that I was emotionally controlling and kept her isolated from everyone who cared about her. I met Lily on a Tuesday evening in October, crumpled on a bench outside the campus library with mascara streaking down her cheeks and hands shaking so violently she couldn't hold her phone steady enough to make a call. She was hyperventilating in the specific way that indicates panic attack rather than ordinary crying, chest heaving with irregular breaths that weren't bringing enough oxygen to calm her racing heart. Before we get into the part that still hurts to tell, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you don't miss more deep, raw stories like this. My first instinct was to keep walking. Other people's mental health crises weren't my responsibility, and I had my own problems to manage as a graduate student juggling research, teaching responsibilities, and the general anxiety that comes with trying to build an academic career in an increasingly unstable job market. But something about her complete vulnerability stopped me from continuing past her obvious distress. When I asked if she needed help, Lily looked up at me with eyes that were desperate and grateful in equal measure, as if I were the first person in weeks to notice that she was drowning. She couldn't speak coherently through the panic attack, but she managed to nod when I offered to sit with her until the episode passed and she felt stable enough to get home safely. 20 minutes later, when her breathing had normalized and the shaking had subsided, Lily apologized repeatedly for bothering a stranger with her problems. She explained that panic attacks had been increasing in frequency and intensity over the past month, triggered by academic pressure, social anxiety, and a recent breakup that had left her feeling completely alone and unable to cope with daily stress. Lily was 24, a year younger than me, finishing her master's degree in psychology with the kind of perfectionism that created more problems than it solved. She had moved to the city 6 months earlier for graduate school, leaving behind family and friends who couldn't understand why she was struggling so much with what they saw as normal academic challenges. Her isolation was profound and obvious from our first conversation. Lily mentioned having no close friends in the city, classmates who were too competitive to offer genuine support, and family members who responded to her mental health struggles with advice about positive thinking and exercise rather than empathy or practical assistance. The recent breakup had been particularly devastating because her ex-boyfriend had been her primary source of emotional support during the early adjustment to graduate school. His departure had left her without anyone to call during panic attacks, no one to provide reassurance during periods of overwhelming anxiety, and no safe person to help her navigate social situations that triggered her developing agoraphobia. Lily's vulnerability that evening was so complete and genuine that it activated every protective instinct I possessed. Here was someone brilliant and kind who was struggling with circumstances that were overwhelming her capacity to cope independently. She needed someone stable and patient who could provide the emotional safety net that her mental health required during this difficult period. I offered to walk her home, then found myself staying for 2 hours while she talked through the anxiety that had triggered the panic attack. Lily was articulate and insightful about her mental health challenges, able to identify triggers and patterns while being unable to manage them effectively when she was alone and overwhelmed. Her apartment was sparse and impersonal, the living space of someone who had moved frequently and never felt settled anywhere long enough to create a real home. The refrigerator was nearly empty, the furniture was minimal and obviously secondhand, and the general atmosphere suggested someone who was surviving rather than thriving in her new environment. When I left that evening, Lily asked if she could call me if she had another panic attack, explaining that having someone to talk to during episodes made them shorter and less intense. The request seemed reasonable and compassionate, an easy way to provide support to someone who was struggling with mental health challenges that weren't their fault. I gave her my number and meant it when I said she could call anytime she needed someone to talk her through anxiety or panic. Lily's gratitude was overwhelming and touching, as if I had offered something extraordinary rather than basic human kindness to someone in crisis. The first call came 3 days later at 11 p.m., Lily sobbing and hyperventilating after a panic attack triggered by academic pressure and fear of failure. I talked her through breathing exercises, helped her identify the thoughts that were escalating her anxiety, and stayed on the phone until she felt calm enough to sleep. The second call came 5 days after that, during another evening panic attack that left her afraid to be alone in her apartment. This time I went over in person, bringing tea and staying until her anxiety subsided enough for her to feel safe. Lily's relief at having someone present during her crisis was so profound that it made the inconvenience of leaving my own evening plans feel worthwhile. Within 2 weeks, I had become Lily's primary crisis support system, the person she called when anxiety became unmanageable, when panic attacks left her afraid and disoriented, when social situations triggered responses that she couldn't handle independently. Her need for support was genuine and desperate, but it was also becoming constant and comprehensive. Lily's anxiety seemed to be triggered by almost everything: academic deadlines, social interactions, being alone, being in crowds, making decisions, changes in routine, and unpredictable daily stressors that most people managed without crisis-level responses. Her calls for support were becoming daily occurrences that required immediate attention, regardless of my own schedule or availability. But Lily's gratitude for my support was so overwhelming and consistent that it made the increasing demands feel meaningful rather than burdensome. She would thank me repeatedly for being the only person who understood her struggles, who didn't judge her for having mental health challenges, who was patient enough to help her through episodes without making her feel guilty or ashamed. Her dependence on my support was framed as temporary necessity while she developed better coping strategies and adjusted to the stress of graduate school. Lily spoke about eventually needing less help, becoming more independent, and building other support systems that would reduce the pressure on our developing relationship. 3 weeks after we met, Lily had her first panic attack while I was on a date with someone else. She called crying and hyperventilating, unable to calm down without talking through her anxiety with someone who understood her triggers and coping strategies. I excused myself from dinner to take the call, spending 30 minutes helping Lily through her crisis while my date waited uncomfortably at our table. When I returned to dinner, the woman I was with expressed concern about the interruption and asked whether I was always available for mental health emergencies from friends. Her question made me defensive about Lily's legitimate need for support, though I couldn't articulate why providing crisis intervention for someone's panic attacks was different from other friendship obligations. That night, after my date ended awkwardly with discussion about boundaries and availability, I began wondering whether Lily's need for support was affecting other relationships in ways that weren't sustainable long-term. But her vulnerability and gratitude made questioning the arrangement feel cruel and unsupportive. Lily's improvement seemed to depend entirely on having consistent access to emotional support that only I was qualified to provide. Other people didn't understand her anxiety, weren't patient with her panic attacks, or couldn't provide the specific type of reassurance that helped her manage overwhelming emotions effectively. My psychology background made me particularly suited to support Lily through her mental health challenges, she explained. I understood anxiety disorders, could recognize escalating symptoms, and knew techniques for helping someone through panic attacks that friends without clinical training couldn't provide as effectively. The relationship that developed from this crisis support was intense and meaningful in ways that felt significant and special. Lily needed me in ways that no one had ever needed me before, depended on my presence and understanding for her basic emotional stability and daily functioning. Within a month, I was spending most evenings at Lily's apartment, providing companionship that prevented anxiety triggers and immediate support when panic attacks occurred despite preventive measures. Her place became more familiar than my own, her schedule more important than my schedule, her emotional needs the primary factor in my daily planning. Lily's professors and classmates knew me as her boyfriend and primary support person, someone who accompanied her to social events when anxiety made independent attendance impossible, who provided emotional stability that allowed her to function in academic and social environments that would otherwise be overwhelming. The role felt important and meaningful, being someone's safe person during a mental health crisis that required comprehensive support and understanding. Lily's progress seemed directly related to having consistent emotional safety, and I was providing something that genuinely improved her quality of life and daily functioning. But even during those early weeks when Lily's gratitude felt genuine and her need for support seemed temporary, there were subtle signs that her relationship with my assistance was becoming possessive rather than appreciative. She would become anxious when I mentioned other friends or obligations, worried that my attention was being divided in ways that might affect my availability during her emergencies. Lily's conversations about other people in her life often included criticism or dismissal that seemed designed to emphasize how much more understanding and supportive I was compared to everyone else. Her family didn't understand mental health, her classmates were judgmental, her professors were unsympathetic, and previous boyfriends had been impatient with her anxiety. Only I seemed to possess the combination of patience, understanding, and clinical knowledge necessary to support her through this difficult period. The specialness of our connection was presented as evidence of compatibility rather than warning about exclusivity that might become problematic. 2 months after we met, Lily suggested I move into her apartment, ostensibly to save money on rent, but actually to ensure my availability during nighttime panic attacks and early morning anxiety episodes that were becoming more frequent and severe. The practical benefits were obvious: shared expenses, closer proximity to campus, and more efficient support provision that wouldn't require me to travel across town during emotional emergencies. But moving in together also meant that Lily's anxiety would become the primary factor in our shared living environment, that my presence would be expected rather than chosen. I agreed to the arrangement because Lily's need for support seemed genuine and temporary, because living together would allow me to help her more effectively, and because the intensity of being someone's safe person felt meaningful in ways that justified the sacrifices it required. What I didn't understand yet was that becoming Lily's safe place meant becoming her only place, that providing emotional sanctuary meant accepting imprisonment within the boundaries of someone else's comfort zone. I thought I was helping someone heal from anxiety and trauma. I didn't realize I was enabling someone who confused love with possession, safety with control, and support with surrender of independence. 6 months into living together, my existence had been completely restructured around Lily's anxiety triggers, panic attack schedule, and need for constant emotional regulation that required my presence, attention, and immediate availability 24 hours a day. What had started as emergency crisis support had evolved into comprehensive life management, where every decision, activity, and relationship was filtered through the lens of how it might affect Lily's mental health stability. The apartment we shared had become a carefully controlled environment designed to minimize anxiety triggers and maximize Lily's sense of safety and predictability. Lighting was kept soft to avoid overstimulation. Noise levels were monitored constantly because sudden sounds could trigger panic responses. The temperature was regulated precisely because discomfort could escalate into anxiety episodes that required hours of intervention and recovery time. My daily schedule revolved entirely around Lily's academic calendar, therapy appointments, and emotional needs that seemed to intensify rather than improve despite months of comprehensive support and professional treatment. Morning routines required careful orchestration to prevent anxiety about daily tasks. Evening activities were planned around her energy levels and social capacity. Weekends were devoted to recovery from weekly stress and preparation for upcoming challenges. Lily's panic attacks had not decreased in frequency or intensity, as her therapist had predicted they would, with consistent support and medication adjustments. If anything, they had become more elaborate and demanding, requiring longer recovery periods and more comprehensive intervention strategies that consumed hours of each day and most of my emotional energy. The attacks themselves had evolved into complex productions that seemed designed to demonstrate the severity of Lily's distress and the necessity of my immediate, undivided attention. She would hyperventilate dramatically, clutch at her chest, and make statements about feeling like she was dying that required extensive reassurance and medical validation that the symptoms were anxiety rather than cardiac emergency. During these episodes, Lily needed me to hold her while she cried, talk her through breathing exercises that seemed less effective over time, and provide verbal reassurance about her safety, our relationship, and her ability to survive whatever situation had triggered the panic response. The intervention process could last anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours, depending on factors that seemed increasingly arbitrary. What concerned me most was how Lily's anxiety had begun targeting situations that might reduce my availability to provide support. Social events with my friends triggered panic attacks that required me to leave immediately or cancel plans entirely. Work obligations that kept me away for extended periods generated such severe anticipatory anxiety that I would spend hours managing her distress before and after any absence from our shared routine. Family visits had become impossible because Lily's anxiety about being left alone was so severe that she couldn't function independently for the time required to maintain relationships with people who had been important to me before she became the central focus of my daily existence. My parents had stopped inviting me to holiday gatherings because they knew I would decline rather than leave Lily during periods when she felt particularly vulnerable. The isolation was gradual but systematic, each relationship gradually sacrificed to accommodate Lily's needs for my exclusive attention and availability. Friends who had been close before Lily's crisis began dropping away as I canceled plans repeatedly, declined invitations consistently, and became unavailable for the casual social interactions that maintain adult friendships outside of romantic relationships. Lily's awareness of these social losses was complete, but presented as unavoidable consequences of her mental health needs, rather than choices she was making about how my time and energy should be allocated. She would express guilt about my sacrifices while explaining why each abandoned relationship or missed opportunity was necessary for her stability and recovery. My work performance was suffering from the constant interruptions and emotional exhaustion that came from managing someone else's mental health crisis as a full-time job alongside my actual full-time job. Lily would call or text during work hours when anxiety escalated, requiring immediate attention that disrupted meetings, research time, and professional relationships that were crucial for my career development. The calls were always framed as emergencies that couldn't wait until I was available, though the emergencies often involved anticipated anxiety about future events rather than immediate crises requiring urgent intervention. Lily's inability to tolerate any delay in receiving support meant that my professional obligations were consistently interrupted by her emotional needs. When I tried to establish boundaries around work hours and professional commitments, Lily's response was immediate escalation of anxiety symptoms that seemed designed to demonstrate how cruel and unsupportive such limitations would be. She would have panic attacks triggered by my suggestion that some situations could wait until evening, proving that her needs were too urgent and severe for normal relationship boundaries. The manipulation was subtle and clothed in legitimate mental health language that made questioning it feel insensitive and unsupportive. Lily never directly demanded that I prioritize her needs over professional obligations, but her anxiety responses to any suggestion of limited availability made such prioritization inevitable if I wanted to maintain peace in our shared living environment. My family's concern about the relationship dynamics had evolved from gentle questioning to direct intervention attempts that Lily interpreted as threats to our connection and her emotional safety. When my sister visited and commented on how different I seemed, how isolated I had become, and how completely my life revolved around managing Lily's needs, Lily had a severe panic attack that required hours of recovery time. The message was clear: criticism of our relationship dynamics or suggestions that I might be overfunctioning as Lily's caretaker would be met with immediate emotional crisis that proved how necessary my comprehensive support actually was. Any attempt to examine the healthiness of our arrangement triggered responses that demonstrated why such examination was dangerous to Lily's well-being. Lily's therapy sessions had become another source of validation for the current arrangement rather than exploration of strategies for increasing her independence or reducing her reliance on my emotional regulation. Her therapist, who knew only Lily's version of our relationship dynamics, supported the idea that having consistent emotional support was crucial for anxiety management during this transitional period. The professional validation made questioning Lily's needs feel not just unsupportive, but potentially harmful to someone who was working hard in therapy to address legitimate mental health challenges. If her trained therapist believed that my comprehensive availability was therapeutic rather than enabling, who was I to suggest that the arrangement might be unhealthy for either of us? But I was beginning to notice that Lily's anxiety seemed to increase rather than decrease in direct proportion to how much support I provided. The more available I became, the more availability she seemed to require. The more I accommodated her triggers, the more situations became triggering. The more I managed her emotional regulation, the less capable she seemed of managing it independently. The pattern suggested that my comprehensive support was creating dependency rather than healing, that my presence was becoming a crutch that prevented Lily from developing the coping skills necessary for independent functioning. But questioning this dynamic required acknowledging that months of sacrifice and support might have been counterproductive rather than helpful. Lily's social life outside our relationship had contracted to nearly nothing, but she presented this isolation as temporary necessity while she worked on her mental health rather than concerning withdrawal from normal adult relationships and activities. She couldn't handle the unpredictability of social interactions, the potential for judgment or misunderstanding, or the energy demands of maintaining friendships while managing severe anxiety. Only I understood her well enough to provide social interaction that felt safe and supportive rather than draining and overwhelming. Other people required emotional energy that she needed to reserve for basic daily functioning and recovery work. Social isolation was self-care rather than avoidance, protection rather than withdrawal. The logic was compelling and presented with therapeutic language that made disagreement seem ignorant about mental health recovery processes. But the result was that Lily had no relationships, interests, or activities that didn't involve me directly, creating a dynamic where I was her entire world rather than an important part of a balanced life. My own interests and hobbies had been gradually abandoned as Lily's needs expanded to fill all available time and energy. Reading for pleasure triggered anxiety about being ignored. Exercise routines were interrupted by panic attacks that required immediate attention. Creative projects were abandoned because focus on anything other than Lily's emotional needs felt selfish and unsupportive. The person I had been before meeting Lily was disappearing, replaced by someone whose entire identity revolved around being a caretaker and emotional support provider. My thoughts, conversations, and daily planning centered around anxiety management, trigger avoidance, and crisis prevention strategies that had become more important than any personal goals or interests. Lily's appreciation for my sacrifice was consistent and overwhelming, presented as evidence that our relationship was deeper and more meaningful than ordinary romantic connections that didn't require such comprehensive mutual support. The intensity of her need for me was proof of our special connection, the uniqueness of our bond, and the irreplaceable nature of what I provided for her recovery. But the appreciation felt increasingly hollow because it was contingent on my continued availability rather than respect for my autonomy. Lily was grateful for what I did for her while being unable to imagine that I might need anything that wasn't related to supporting her through her mental health challenges. The relationship had become entirely unidirectional, with all emotional energy flowing toward Lily's needs, while my needs were either ignored or reframed as obstacles to her recovery. I was expected to be endlessly patient, consistently available, and emotionally regulated at all times because Lily's stability depended on having at least one person in her life who never needed support themselves. My friends who remained in contact had begun expressing concern about the changes they observed in my personality, availability, and priorities. They could see that I was becoming isolated, exhausted, and absorbed in someone else's problems to the exclusion of everything else that had previously been important to me. But their concerns felt like attacks on Lily's legitimate need for support and evidence that they didn't understand the reality of loving someone with severe mental health challenges. Their suggestions that I was overfunctioning or enabling dependency seemed cruel and ignorant about what recovery actually required from supportive partners. 6 months into living together, I was beginning to understand that being someone's safe place had made me a prisoner in my own life, that providing emotional sanctuary had required surrendering my independence and identity to someone whose needs had expanded to consume everything I was willing to sacrifice. But Lily still curled up in my arms after panic attacks, whispering that I was the only person who made her feel safe in the world. And despite the growing exhaustion and isolation, that felt like the most important thing I could be for someone I loved. 1 year into living together, my identity had been completely absorbed into being Lily's caretaker, emotional regulator, and sole connection to the outside world. I no longer recognized myself in mirrors or conversations, having become someone whose thoughts, reactions, and daily existence were entirely determined by another person's anxiety levels and emotional needs. The man I had been before meeting Lily felt like a character from someone else's life story. The guilt trips had become Lily's primary method of maintaining my exclusive attention and availability whenever I showed signs of wanting independent relationships or activities. Any mention of spending time with friends, visiting family, or pursuing personal interests was met with immediate anxiety escalation that demonstrated how selfish and unsupportive such desires were given her fragile mental state. The pattern was predictable and devastating in its effectiveness. I would mention wanting to attend a work social event or visit my parents for the weekend, and Lily would begin experiencing anticipatory anxiety about being alone that required hours of reassurance and crisis management. By the time her panic subsided, the event would be over or the visit would be impossible, and I would feel guilty for having triggered her distress through my selfish desires for independence. Lily had learned to weaponize mental health language in ways that made any attempt at boundary setting appear cruel and ignorant about trauma recovery. When I suggested that she might benefit from developing coping strategies that didn't require my presence, she would explain that my suggestion revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of anxiety disorders and the importance of consistent support during healing processes. Professional therapeutic concepts were deployed strategically to shut down conversations about relationship balance or my need for autonomy. Lily would cite articles about trauma bonding, attachment theory, and the role of secure relationships in mental health recovery to prove that my desire for independence was actually harmful to her progress and potentially re-traumatizing given her history of abandonment. The manipulation was sophisticated and effective because it was wrapped in legitimate psychological concepts that made disagreement seem ignorant and unsupportive. How could I argue with therapeutic principles when I wasn't a trained mental health professional? How could I prioritize my comfort over someone's recovery when that recovery depended on having reliable emotional support? My work life had become completely untenable as Lily's need for contact and reassurance expanded to consume most of my productive hours. She would call or text multiple times during work days, each contact framed as urgent anxiety management that couldn't wait until evening when I was available for personal conversations. The interruptions were destroying my professional relationships and career prospects in ways that were becoming impossible to hide or manage. Colleagues had begun commenting on my distraction and unavailability during important meetings. My supervisor had mentioned concerns about my commitment and focus during recent performance reviews. When I tried to explain to Lily that constant work interruptions were threatening my employment and our financial security, her response was immediate panic about being a burden coupled with detailed explanations of why her anxiety couldn't accommodate normal boundaries around professional obligations. Lily would remind me that anxiety doesn't follow schedules, that panic attacks require immediate intervention, and that delaying support could escalate symptoms into more severe episodes that would require even more time and attention to resolve. The logic was circular and inescapable. Providing less support now would require providing more support later. Missing family events had become so routine that my relatives had stopped extending invitations, knowing that I would decline rather than leave Lily alone during periods when she felt particularly vulnerable. Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthdays, and graduations were sacrificed to accommodate Lily's inability to tolerate my absence during what should have been celebratory occasions. Lily's anxiety about family gatherings was presented as trauma response rather than manipulative control, rooted in her childhood experiences with family dysfunction and her current need for predictable, stable environments during recovery. Attending family events would trigger abandonment fears that could set her healing back months or years. The explanation was compelling and supported by therapeutic concepts that made questioning it seem cruel and ignorant. But the result was that I was cut off from family relationships that had been important to me throughout my life, isolated from support systems that might have provided perspective about the unhealthy dynamics developing in my romantic relationship. My personal interests had been completely abandoned, as Lily's emotional needs expanded to fill every moment of free time that wasn't devoted to work or basic life maintenance. Reading, exercise, creative hobbies, and social activities were all sacrificed to accommodate her need for constant companionship and immediate availability during anxiety episodes. When I tried to maintain any independent activities, Lily's response was immediate distress about feeling abandoned and unloved, coupled with detailed explanations of how my desire for personal time revealed that I didn't understand the severity of her mental health challenges or the importance of consistent support during recovery. The message was clear: loving someone with mental health challenges meant sacrificing personal interests and independence to provide the comprehensive support that recovery required. Any desire for autonomy was evidence of insufficient commitment to the relationship and inadequate understanding of trauma recovery processes. My sleep had become completely disrupted by Lily's nighttime anxiety and panic attacks that seemed to intensify during evening hours when her daytime distractions were unavailable. She would wake me multiple times each night for reassurance about intrusive thoughts, comfort during anxiety episodes, or simply companionship when her mind was too active to allow rest. The sleep deprivation was affecting every aspect of my functioning: physical health, emotional regulation, cognitive performance, and professional capability. But when I suggested that Lily might benefit from developing independent coping strategies for nighttime anxiety, her response was immediate panic about being abandoned during her most vulnerable hours. Lily would remind me that nighttime was when trauma symptoms were most severe, when the mind was most susceptible to intrusive thoughts and overwhelming emotions. Suggesting that she manage these experiences alone was essentially suggesting that she suffer without support during the most difficult parts of her recovery process. The therapeutic language made my need for sleep seem selfish and unsupportive compared to Lily's need for consistent emotional regulation assistance. How could I prioritize my comfort over someone's mental health crisis? How could I sleep peacefully while someone I loved was struggling with trauma symptoms? Walking on eggshells had become my permanent state of existence, carefully monitoring every word, action, and expression to avoid triggering anxiety responses that would require hours of crisis management and emotional repair work. Casual conversations required strategic planning to avoid topics that might escalate into panic attacks or extended processing sessions. The hypervigilance was exhausting and created an environment where authentic communication became impossible because honesty might trigger emotional crises that were more difficult to manage than the problems we needed to discuss. I learned to suppress my own emotions, needs, and opinions to maintain the artificial stability that Lily's mental health seemed to require. But the stability was illusion because it was entirely dependent on my ability to anticipate and prevent all potential sources of anxiety in Lily's environment. The moment I failed to predict a trigger or prevent a stressor, the entire system would collapse into crisis that demonstrated how crucial my comprehensive management actually was. My friends had begun expressing serious concern about the changes they observed in my personality, behavior, and availability during the rare occasions when we had contact. They could see that I had become someone different, someone whose entire existence revolved around managing another person's emotional state at the expense of everything else that had previously been important to me. Their interventions were met with defensive explanations about the realities of supporting someone through mental health recovery, about the temporary nature of the current arrangement, and about their lack of understanding regarding what love actually required when tested by serious psychological challenges. But their concerns were persistent and increasingly direct, pointing out that healthy relationships didn't require one person to sacrifice their entire identity and social network to accommodate the other person's needs. They could see that I was drowning while trying to keep someone else afloat, that my attempts to help were actually enabling dependency rather than promoting recovery. The most painful intervention came from my sister Emma, who visited unannounced one evening and witnessed firsthand the dynamic that had developed between Lily and me. She watched Lily have a panic attack when I mentioned having coffee with a colleague, observed the hours of reassurance and crisis management that followed, and saw how completely my evening was consumed by emotional labor that seemed designed to prevent future independence rather than address current distress. Emma's direct confrontation about the unhealthy relationship dynamics triggered one of Lily's most severe panic episodes, complete with hyperventilation, chest pain, and statements about feeling like she was dying that required consideration of emergency medical intervention. The message was unmistakable. Criticism of our relationship was dangerous to Lily's mental health and potentially life-threatening. After Emma left that evening, shaken by the intensity of Lily's response to her concerns, Lily spent hours processing the trauma of feeling attacked and unsupported by someone who was supposed to care about my well-being. The conversation became evidence of why other people couldn't be trusted, why our relationship needed protection from outside interference, and why isolation was necessary for her recovery. The incident reinforced everything Lily had been teaching me about the dangers of outside relationships and the importance of prioritizing her emotional needs over other people's opinions about our dynamic. Emma's concern was reframed as attack, her love as interference, and her perspective as ignorance about mental health recovery processes. 1 year into living together, I was completely isolated from friends, family, and personal interests, existing solely as Lily's emotional support system and anxiety management specialist. My identity had been absorbed into being her caretaker, my social world had contracted to include only her needs, and my future plans revolved entirely around accommodating her recovery timeline. But Lily still curled up in my arms after panic attacks, whispering that I was the only person who made her feel safe in the world, that I was the best thing that had ever happened to her, that she couldn't survive without my love and support. And despite the exhaustion, isolation, and growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with our dynamic, those words still felt like the most important validation I could receive. Being someone's entire world felt meaningful, even as it was destroying everything else that had once made my life worth living. I was learning that love could be both genuine and suffocating, that care could be both healing and harmful, that being someone's safe place could make you a prisoner in your own existence. But I still didn't understand that Lily's need for safety was actually need for control, that her vulnerability was actually manipulation, and that my desire to help was enabling someone who confused love with possession. 18 months into our relationship, I attempted to set my first healthy boundary by suggesting that Lily might benefit from spending one evening per week with other people or engaging in activities that didn't require my presence. The conversation that followed would transform me from Lily's savior into her oppressor, from the source of her healing into the cause of all her problems, in ways that left me questioning my own memory of our shared history. The boundary itself was modest and reasonable, one evening per week where I could visit friends, attend work events, or simply have time alone to recharge from the constant emotional labor that our relationship required. I presented it as beneficial for both of us, an opportunity for Lily to practice independence while I maintained the social connections and personal interests that healthy adults need for balanced living. Lily's reaction was immediate and explosive, a panic response more severe than any I had witnessed during our months together. She began hyperventilating while sobbing about abandonment, explaining through her tears that my suggestion revealed how little I understood about trauma recovery and how cruel I was being to someone who was still healing from deep psychological wounds. But this panic attack felt different from the others, more calculated, more performative, designed to demonstrate the devastating impact of my unreasonable demands rather than express genuine emotional distress. The timing, intensity, and specific content of her response seemed crafted to make me feel guilty for having basic relationship needs rather than to process legitimate anxiety about temporary separation. Within hours, Lily had reframed my request for one evening per week of independence as evidence of fundamental problems in my character and commitment to our relationship. I was being selfish, she explained, prioritizing my social life over her mental health. I was being unsupportive, failing to understand that recovery required consistent presence from trusted partners. I was being cruel, suggesting that someone with severe anxiety should be forced to face their triggers alone. The language Lily used to describe my boundary attempt was therapeutic but accusatory, suggesting that my desire for independence revealed deeper issues with empathy, commitment, and understanding of mental health challenges. She had never seen this side of me before, she said, and was disappointed to discover that I could be so unsupportive when she needed me most. But the most devastating aspect of Lily's response was how quickly she began sharing her new perspective on our relationship with her therapist, presenting me as someone who was trying to control her recovery process by limiting the support she needed for healing. Within days, I had been transformed from devoted partner into potential obstacle to her psychological well-being. Lily's therapy sessions became focused on examining my behavior for signs of emotional manipulation and control, with her therapist apparently supporting the interpretation that my request for independence was concerning given Lily's vulnerability and need for consistent support. The professional validation of her perspective made questioning it seem not just wrong but potentially abusive. The shift in how Lily talked about our relationship was swift and comprehensive, moving from gratitude for my support to analysis of my motivations and methods. She began questioning whether my care had always been genuine or whether it had been strategic manipulation designed to create dependency that I could later exploit for control. Previous acts of support were re-examined through this new lens, with Lily discovering troubling patterns in my behavior that she had missed during the early stages of our relationship. My availability during her crisis had been love bombing designed to create trauma bonding. My willingness to accommodate her anxiety triggers had been grooming to establish control. My isolation from friends and family had been strategic rather than circumstantial. The reinterpretation of our history was thorough and devastating, transforming every sacrifice I had made into evidence of manipulation, every boundary I had respected into proof of calculation, every moment of care into demonstration of ulterior motives. Lily was discovering that she had been in an emotionally abusive relationship disguised as supportive partnership. Her therapist's apparent endorsement of this interpretation made it feel not just valid but professionally confirmed. If a trained mental health professional could see the controlling patterns in my behavior, then Lily's new understanding of our relationship must be accurate rather than defensive reframing of reasonable boundary setting. The most confusing aspect of this transformation was how completely Lily seemed to believe her revised version of our relationship history. She wasn't lying about my behavior. She had genuinely convinced herself that my comprehensive support had been comprehensive manipulation, that my sacrifice had been strategy, that my love had been a sophisticated form of emotional abuse. Lily began sharing this new understanding with mutual acquaintances, explaining that she was finally recognizing the controlling dynamics that had developed in our relationship and working with her therapist to establish healthier boundaries. The people who knew us began looking at me differently, seeing potential abuser where they had previously seen devoted partner. The social consequences were immediate and devastating. Friends who had admired my commitment to supporting Lily through her mental health challenges began questioning whether that support had actually been harmful, whether my isolation had been chosen rather than imposed, whether my comprehensive care had been enabling rather than healing. But the most painful part was understanding that Lily's new narrative served multiple psychological functions that made it more appealing than acknowledging the reality of my genuine support and reasonable boundary needs. Casting me as controlling allowed her to avoid examining her own behavior, to justify her dependency, and to gain sympathy from people who saw her as escaping emotional abuse. The therapeutic breakthrough that positioned me as the problem in our relationship was actually Lily's way of avoiding responsibility for the unhealthy dynamics she had created through her demands for exclusive attention and total availability. Making me the villain allowed her to maintain her victim identity while beginning to establish the independence she had always been capable of but had chosen not to develop. Lily's discovery that claiming I was controlling generated immediate sympathy and support from people who wanted to help someone escape emotional abuse was revelatory for her. The social validation and professional concern were more satisfying than the private gratitude she had expressed during our months of comprehensive support. Being seen as a survivor rather than someone who was dependent felt better than acknowledging that her mental health challenges had been used to manipulate someone into sacrificing their entire life for her emotional regulation. The narrative of escape was more empowering than the reality of having been genuinely cared for by someone she had systematically isolated and exploited. My confusion about this transformation was profound and disorienting because I had lived through our relationship and knew that my support had been genuine, my sacrifices had been voluntary, and my isolation had been the result of her anxiety rather than my control. But Lily's conviction about her new interpretation was so complete that it made me question my own memory and motivations. Had I been unconsciously manipulative? Had my support been conditional in ways I hadn't recognized? Had my accommodation of her anxiety triggers actually been subtle control disguised as care? The therapeutic language Lily used to describe my behavior was sophisticated enough to make me doubt my own experience of our relationship. The gaslighting was effective because it was wrapped in legitimate psychological concepts and professional validation that made disagreement seem defensive rather than accurate. If Lily's therapist could see controlling patterns in my behavior, and if Lily herself was recognizing manipulation she had previously missed, then perhaps my understanding of our relationship had been flawed from the beginning. But the timing of Lily's breakthrough was suspicious, coinciding perfectly with my first attempt to establish boundaries rather than emerging from genuine therapeutic insight or recovered memories of abuse. The discovery of my controlling nature happened precisely when I stopped being completely available, suggesting that the abuse narrative was reactive rather than revelatory. Lily's new understanding of our relationship also conveniently positioned her as someone who had been victimized rather than someone who had been demanding, as someone who had been isolated rather than someone who had been isolating, as someone who had been controlled rather than someone who had been controlling. The role reversal was complete and internally consistent, providing Lily with a narrative that explained our unhealthy dynamics while absolving her of any responsibility for creating them. I had been the problem all along. She had just been too traumatized and vulnerable to recognize the manipulation until her therapy helped her develop insight and self-advocacy skills. My attempts to defend myself or provide alternative perspectives on our relationship history were interpreted as further evidence of controlling behavior, proof that I was trying to manipulate her into doubting her therapeutic progress and returning to the dynamic where I held all the power. The impossible situation was that any response I made to Lily's accusations would be seen as confirmation of her new understanding of my character. Defending myself was manipulation. Accepting her perspective was admission of guilt. Remaining silent was passive-aggressive control. There was no response that wouldn't validate her interpretation of me as emotionally abusive. The therapeutic and social support systems that surrounded Lily's new narrative made challenging it seem not just wrong but potentially harmful to someone who was finally recognizing abuse and developing the strength to establish boundaries with her abuser. I had become the designated villain in a story that required a villain for Lily to become the hero of her own recovery. The most devastating realization was that Lily needed to make me the enemy to justify the independence she had always been capable of but had chosen not to develop. Her growth required my vilification, her strength required my weakness, her story of survival required my transformation into the thing she had survived. 18 months into our relationship, I had become the controlling ex-boyfriend in Lily's therapeutic narrative, the manipulative partner she was learning to recognize and resist, the emotional abuser she was finally strong enough to leave. The man who had sacrificed everything to provide safety and support had become the danger she needed protection from. But the most confusing part was that Lily's accusations contained just enough partial truth to feel believable. I had been isolated, though by her anxiety rather than my choice. Our relationship had been unbalanced, though in her favor rather than mine. I had been controlling her environment, though to manage her triggers rather than limit her freedom. The therapeutic reframing took these circumstantial truths and reversed their causality, making me responsible for dynamics that I had been accommodating rather than creating. The support I had provided became manipulation, the boundaries I had respected became control, the sacrifices I had made became evidence of ulterior motives. Lily's new understanding of our relationship was gaining momentum and validation that made it feel more real than the actual history we had shared. Her truth was becoming the truth, supported by professional opinion and social sympathy that positioned her as survivor and me as perpetrator. The man who had given up friends, family, career opportunities, and personal identity to provide comprehensive emotional support was learning that love could be rewritten as abuse, that sacrifice could be reframed as manipulation, and that being someone's safe place could be reconstructed as being their prison guard. I was discovering that some people heal by creating villains from their helpers, that recovery sometimes requires rewriting history to make healing possible, and that being genuinely supportive can become evidence of being genuinely dangerous if the story requires a dangerous person to overcome. 2 years after our relationship ended, I was sitting in a coffee shop when I overheard Lily talking to someone I didn't recognize, describing her escape from an emotionally abusive relationship with a controlling boyfriend who had isolated her from friends and family while pretending to be supportive. The story she told bore no resemblance to the relationship I remembered living through, but it was delivered with such conviction and therapeutic sophistication that even I began to doubt my own memories. According to Lily's version of events, I had systematically isolated her from her support systems by creating anxiety about social situations, manipulated her mental health struggles to make her dependent on me, and used her vulnerability to establish control over every aspect of her life. The comprehensive support I thought I had been providing was actually comprehensive manipulation designed to trap someone during their most vulnerable period. Her narrative was compelling and internally consistent, describing patterns of emotional abuse that aligned perfectly with clinical descriptions of controlling relationships. Lily spoke about love bombing during the early stages of our connection, about gradual isolation from friends and family, about having her reality questioned whenever she expressed discomfort with the relationship dynamics. The person listening to her story responded with appropriate sympathy and admiration for her strength in recognizing and escaping such sophisticated manipulation. Lily had clearly become skilled at presenting herself as a survivor of emotional abuse rather than someone who had systematically exploited another person's empathy and willingness to sacrifice. The transformation of our mutual social circle's perception of me was swift and comprehensive once Lily began sharing her new understanding of our relationship. Friends who had witnessed my isolation and exhaustion during our time together now interpreted those signs as evidence that I had been the manipulator rather than the manipulated, the controller rather than the controlled. Lily's therapeutic language and professional validation gave her credibility that my defensive responses couldn't match. She could cite specific types of emotional abuse, reference therapeutic concepts about trauma bonding and manipulation tactics, and present herself as someone who had gained insight through professional help rather than someone who was rewriting history to avoid accountability. The mutual friends who took sides overwhelmingly chose Lily's version of events, partly because her narrative was more dramatic and satisfying than the complex reality of our codependent dysfunction, and partly because supporting someone who claimed to be escaping abuse felt morally clear in ways that examining nuanced relationship dynamics did not. My attempts to provide alternative perspectives on our relationship history were interpreted as continued attempts to manipulate and control Lily's narrative about her own experience. Any defense I offered was seen as evidence of the controlling behavior she was describing. Any documentation I provided was dismissed as manipulation tactics used by abusers to confuse their victims. The impossible situation was that Lily's accusations were structured in ways that made them unfalsifiable. Every piece of evidence that contradicted her narrative could be reinterpreted as proof of my sophistication as a manipulator. My genuine care became calculated manipulation, my sacrifice became strategic control, my accommodation of her needs became enablement designed to create dependency. The social consequences extended beyond our immediate friend group to professional and community contexts where Lily had shared her story of survival and recovery. I became known as someone who had emotionally abused a vulnerable person, someone whose apparent kindness masked controlling and manipulative tendencies that were dangerous to recognize and avoid. Dating became complicated by the reputation Lily had created around my character and behavior in relationships. Women who knew her story were naturally cautious about someone who had been described as emotionally abusive, and those who didn't know the specifics often learned about my past through social networks that had accepted Lily's version of our relationship as factual. My professional life was affected as well, with colleagues and clients occasionally expressing concern or discomfort based on rumors about my personal relationships. The mental health field where I worked was particularly sensitive to allegations of emotional abuse, and even unproven accusations could affect professional opportunities and collaborative relationships. The legal implications were less severe but still present, with Lily having consulted attorneys about potential restraining orders and harassment claims based on my attempts to maintain mutual friendships and provide alternative perspectives on our relationship. The mere possibility of legal action created additional pressure to accept her narrative rather than challenge it publicly. But the most devastating aspect of Lily's historical revision was watching her thrive socially and professionally while building her success story on the foundation of my supposed abuse. She had developed a large network of supporters who admired her strength in overcoming emotional manipulation, her insight in recognizing controlling behavior, and her courage in sharing her story to help other potential victims. Lily's social media presence during this period was carefully curated to showcase her recovery and growth, featuring inspirational quotes about overcoming abuse, photos of social activities that demonstrated her renewed independence, and testimonials from friends who supported her journey of healing and self-discovery. The contrast between her public narrative of liberation and the private reality of our relationship was staggering. The woman who had been unable to function independently for months, who had required constant emotional regulation and crisis management, who had systematically isolated me from all outside relationships, was now presenting herself as someone who had escaped isolation imposed by someone else. Lily's therapeutic breakthrough had apparently involved recognizing that her previous dependence on me had been the result of manipulation rather than genuine mental health challenges. Her anxiety and panic attacks were reframed as trauma responses to emotional abuse rather than symptoms of anxiety disorders that had required comprehensive support and professional treatment. The new narrative allowed Lily to maintain her victim identity while developing the independence she had always been capable of but had chosen not to exercise. She could be both strong survivor and vulnerable person who had been harmed, both insightful about abuse dynamics and innocent victim who had been deceived by sophisticated manipulation. Her therapist's role in this transformation remained unclear, but the professional validation of Lily's new understanding of our relationship provided credibility that made challenging her narrative seem not just wrong, but potentially harmful to someone who was finally recognizing abuse and developing healthy boundaries. The therapeutic community's support for Lily's reinterpretation of our relationship reflected broader cultural tendencies to believe abuse allegations without substantial investigation, to support claimed victims without examining the complexity of relationship dynamics, and to view emotional manipulation as one-sided rather than potentially mutual or reciprocal. But Lily's success in rewriting our history was also enabled by the sophisticated psychological language she had learned during our relationship. When I had explained anxiety disorders, trauma responses, and healthy relationship dynamics in attempts to help her understand and manage her mental health challenges. The education I had provided about psychology and relationships became the foundation for her accusations against me, with therapeutic concepts being deployed strategically to support her narrative of victimization and escape. My attempts to help her understand mental health had given her the vocabulary to describe me as mentally unhealthy. The irony was profound but invisible to most observers. The comprehensive emotional education I had provided during our relationship was being used to construct an alternative history where that education was actually indoctrination, where my support was manipulation, where my sacrifice was strategy for control. Lily's new support network consisted of people who knew only her version of our relationship and were naturally sympathetic to someone who claimed to be recovering from emotional abuse. They provided validation and encouragement for her narrative without having witnessed the actual dynamics that had characterized our time together. These supporters were generous with praise for Lily's insight, strength, and growth, creating a social environment where questioning her story would seem cruel and unsupportive. The community that formed around her recovery was invested in her narrative being true because their role as helpers and supporters depended on her being someone who needed help and support. The most painful conversations occurred with mutual friends who had witnessed our relationship firsthand, but chose to accept Lily's reinterpretation rather than defend their own observations and memories. They could see that accepting her narrative was emotionally and socially easier than examining the complex reality of what had actually happened between us. Some friends admitted privately that they remembered the relationship differently, but felt unable to challenge Lily's version publicly because doing so would position them as unsupportive of someone claiming to be an abuse survivor. The social and political dynamics around abuse allegations made questioning victim narratives feel dangerous regardless of the evidence. The few people who maintained relationships with me after Lily's campaign were those who had witnessed our dynamic closely enough to recognize the gap between her narrative and the reality they had observed. They could see that my isolation had been circumstantial rather than chosen, that my exhaustion had been from giving rather than taking, that my behavior had been accommodating rather than controlling. But even these supporters struggled with the cognitive dissonance between their direct observations and the professional validation of Lily's perspective. If her therapist could see controlling patterns in my behavior, and if Lily herself was recognizing abuse she had previously missed, then perhaps their memories were flawed or their understanding of abuse dynamics was inadequate. The most devastating realization was that Lily's rewriting of our history wasn't necessarily conscious deception, but genuine reinterpretation of our shared experiences through a therapeutic framework that required a villain for her to be the hero of her own recovery story. She needed to believe I had been controlling to justify her previous dependence and current independence. 2 years after our relationship ended, Lily had successfully constructed an alternative version of our history that served her emotional needs while destroying my reputation and social connections. The comprehensive support I had provided was remembered as comprehensive abuse, the sacrifice I had made was reframed as manipulation, and the love I had given was reinterpreted as sophisticated control. The person who had curled up in my arms after panic attacks, whispering that I was the only person who made her feel safe in the world, was now telling people that I had been the source of danger she needed protection from. The safe place I had tried to provide had been reconstructed as the prison she had escaped. Lily's new life was built on the foundation of my supposed abuse, her strength measured by her ability to overcome my alleged control, her recovery defined by her distance from the relationship where I had supposedly held her captive through kindness and care. But the most cruel irony was that Lily's transformation into someone who could recognize and resist emotional manipulation had been enabled by the very relationship she now described as manipulative. The independence she celebrated had been built on the foundation of support she now denied ever needing or receiving. The woman who was teaching others to recognize controlling behavior had learned those skills through a relationship with someone who had given up control of his own life to accommodate hers. The survivor of emotional abuse had become empowered by rewriting the story of someone who had been emotionally depleted trying to help her heal. 3 years after our breakup, I was scrolling through LinkedIn when I saw Lily's professional headshot accompanying an article she had written about recognizing emotional abuse in relationships. The confident, successful woman in the photo bore little resemblance to the person who had been unable to function independently for months, but the article she had authored positioned her as an expert on manipulation tactics and recovery from controlling relationships. Her professional transformation was remarkable and deeply ironic. Lily had built a career as a mental health advocate and relationship counselor, speaking at conferences about trauma recovery and writing extensively about the warning signs of emotional abuse. Her expertise was grounded in personal experience that she described as surviving a relationship with someone who had used her vulnerability to establish comprehensive control over her life. The article detailed manipulation tactics that supposedly characterized our relationship: isolation from support systems, exploitation of mental health struggles, creation of dependency through false care, and use of therapeutic language to confuse and control. Every strategy she described was presented as something that had been done to her rather than something she had employed to maintain exclusive access to my time, energy, and emotional resources. Lily's professional success was built on a foundation of expertise derived from her claimed experience as an abuse survivor, but the irony was that her actual expertise came from having been the manipulator rather than the manipulated. She understood controlling behavior intimately because she had practiced it, not because she had suffered from it. Her social media presence during this period showcased a woman who was confident, independent, and socially connected in ways that directly contradicted her narrative about having been isolated and controlled during our relationship. Photos showed her traveling with friends, attending social events, and maintaining the kind of active social life that she had claimed was impossible due to my supposed control. But the most devastating aspect of seeing Lily's success was realizing that her professional identity as someone who had overcome emotional abuse required the continued existence of me as her abuser. Her expertise, speaking engagements, and advocacy work all depended on maintaining the narrative that positioned me as the controlling ex-boyfriend she had courageously escaped. The mutual friends who had chosen to believe Lily's version of our relationship were now citing her professional success and expertise as validation of their choice. If she had become a recognized authority on emotional abuse, then her identification of abusive patterns in our relationship must have been accurate rather than defensive reinterpretation. Lily's transformation into someone who could help others recognize and escape controlling relationships was presented as evidence of her growth and recovery, proof that she had successfully overcome the trauma of our relationship and channeled that experience into meaningful work that helped other potential victims. But the reality was that Lily's professional development had been enabled by rewriting our history in ways that absolved her of responsibility for the unhealthy dynamics she had created, while positioning her as someone who had special insight into manipulation tactics because she had supposedly experienced them firsthand. Her expertise in recognizing controlling behavior was genuine, but derived from having employed those behaviors rather than having been subjected to them. Lily could identify emotional manipulation with sophisticated accuracy because she had practiced it systematically during our relationship, not because she had been victimized by it. The conferences where Lily spoke about overcoming emotional abuse were well attended and well received, with audiences responding positively to her apparent authenticity and hard-won wisdom about relationship dynamics. Her personal story of survival provided credibility that academic knowledge alone couldn't match. But listening to recordings of her presentations was surreal because she described tactics that I had experienced from her rather than employed against her. The isolation she claimed to have suffered was actually isolation she had imposed. The dependency she described as forced was actually dependency she had demanded. The control she claimed to have escaped was actually control she had exercised. Lily's professional writing about emotional abuse included detailed descriptions of how manipulators use mental health crises to maintain control, how they exploit their partner's empathy to avoid accountability, and how they reframe reasonable boundaries as abandonment to prevent their victims from developing independence. Every pattern she identified was accurate, but the roles were reversed. She was describing her own behavior during our relationship while attributing it to me, providing clinical analysis of manipulation tactics she had employed while positioning herself as someone who had suffered from those same tactics. The psychological sophistication of Lily's professional work was impressive and deeply unsettling because it demonstrated her complete understanding of the dynamics that had characterized our relationship. She knew exactly what emotional manipulation looked like because she had practiced it expertly, not because she had been subjected to it. Her articles about trauma bonding, dependency creation, and isolation tactics were clinically accurate descriptions of strategies she had used to maintain exclusive access to my emotional resources, while preventing me from developing relationships or interests that might have provided perspective about our unhealthy dynamic. The most disturbing aspect of Lily's professional success was how her expertise had been gained through victimizing someone else, then reframing that victimization as having been victimized. She had learned about emotional abuse by committing it, then built a career on claiming to have survived it. My own professional reputation had been damaged by association with Lily's narrative, with colleagues in the mental health field occasionally expressing concern or discomfort about working with someone who had been described as emotionally abusive by someone who was now recognized as an expert on abuse dynamics. The professional consequences were subtle but persistent, affecting networking opportunities, collaborative relationships, and career advancement in ways that were difficult to address directly because challenging Lily's narrative would seem defensive and potentially harmful to someone who was helping other alleged abuse survivors. Dating remained complicated by Lily's reputation and the story she had constructed around my character. Women who were familiar with her work or connected to her social network naturally viewed me with suspicion, seeing potential red flags in normal relationship behaviors because they had been primed to expect controlling and manipulative patterns. The few serious relationships I attempted were affected by partners' awareness of allegations about my past behavior, with conversations about relationship dynamics often including implicit or explicit references to emotional abuse patterns that supposedly characterized my previous relationship. But the most painful aspect of Lily's success was watching her receive praise and admiration for overcoming challenges that she had actually created, for recognizing manipulation tactics that she had actually employed, for developing independence that she had always possessed but had chosen not to exercise. Her transformation into someone who could help others was built on a foundation of having harmed someone else, then reframing that harm as having been harmed. The expertise she offered to abuse survivors was gained through creating an abuse survivor of someone who had tried to help her heal. Lily's professional identity required the continued existence of her narrative about our relationship, which meant that my reputation as an emotional abuser needed to be maintained to support her credibility as someone who had survived emotional abuse. Her success depended on my continued vilification. The support groups and therapeutic communities where Lily shared her expertise welcomed her insights about controlling behavior because she could describe manipulation tactics with the kind of detailed accuracy that only comes from intimate familiarity with those strategies. But her familiarity came from having employed the tactics rather than having been subjected to them. Lily could recognize gaslighting because she had practiced it, could identify isolation strategies because she had implemented them, could describe dependency creation because she had engineered it. Her audiences, unaware of the true source of her expertise, responded positively to her apparent authenticity and hard-won wisdom about relationship dynamics. They saw someone who had survived manipulation rather than someone who had practiced it, someone who had overcome control rather than someone who had exercised it. The professional validation of Lily's expertise created a feedback loop that reinforced her narrative about our relationship while making it increasingly difficult to challenge her version of events. If recognized experts in the field accepted her analysis of abusive relationship dynamics, then her identification of abuse in our relationship must be accurate. 3 years after our breakup, Lily had successfully transformed herself from someone who had systematically manipulated and isolated a romantic partner into someone who was professionally recognized for helping others recognize and escape manipulation and isolation. The woman who had been unable to tolerate my absence for a single evening was now teaching others about the importance of independence in healthy relationships. The person who had used mental health crises to control my behavior was now helping others recognize when mental health issues are weaponized for manipulation. Her professional success was genuine and her insights about emotional abuse were accurate, but both were built on a foundation of reversed causality that positioned her as survivor rather than perpetrator, victim rather than manipulator, someone who had escaped control rather than someone who had exercised it. The controller who never controlled had become the expert on control. The manipulator who was never acknowledged as manipulative had become the authority on manipulation, and the person who had isolated someone else had become the voice for those who had been isolated. Lily's career was thriving, her expertise was respected, and her story was inspiring to people who saw her as someone who had overcome adversity to help others facing similar challenges. But the foundation of that success was a complete inversion of reality that required my continued existence as the villain in her heroic narrative. The safe place I had tried to provide had been reconstructed as the danger she had escaped, the support I had offered had been reframed as the control she had overcome, and the sacrifice I had made had been rewritten as the manipulation she had survived. But perhaps most ironically, Lily's transformation into someone who could recognize and resist emotional manipulation had been enabled by the comprehensive emotional education I had provided during our relationship, when I had explained healthy relationship dynamics in attempts to help her understand and address her own controlling behaviors. The very insights she now shared professionally about manipulation tactics and recovery strategies were concepts I had taught her during our relationship, repackaged and redistributed as wisdom gained through surviving the person who had originally provided that education. I still have the journal I kept during the darkest months of our relationship, pages filled with my attempts to understand why providing unconditional support felt increasingly like being held captive by someone else's needs. Reading those entries now, I can see the progression from genuine desire to help someone heal to complete absorption into being someone's emotional life support system, willingly maintained but ultimately unsustainable. 5 years have passed since Lily accused me of being controlling, and her professional success as an expert on emotional abuse continues to grow, while my reputation remains tainted by allegations that reverse the actual power dynamics of our relationship. The irony never stops being painful, watching someone build a career on expertise gained through manipulating others while positioning themselves as the victim of manipulation. But time has provided clarity about what actually happened between us and why Lily needed to rewrite our history so completely. Her transformation from dependent partner to independent professional required a villain to overcome, a source of oppression to escape, a controlling influence to resist. I became that villain not because I had controlled her, but because her growth required someone to have controlled her. The pattern I now recognize is how some people heal by creating enemies from their helpers, how recovery sometimes demands rewriting relationships where they were dependent as relationships where they were oppressed. Lily couldn't acknowledge that she had been genuinely helped because accepting help contradicted the independent, strong person she needed to become. My role as her safe place had indeed become a kind of prison, but I was the prisoner rather than the warden. The safety I provided became the walls that contained my own life. The comfort I offered became the chains that bound me to someone else's emotional regulation. The love I gave became the bars that kept me from maintaining any other relationships or interests. The therapeutic community's acceptance of Lily's narrative reflects broader cultural blindness to how emotional manipulation can flow in directions that contradict traditional power dynamics. The assumption that men control women, that helpers manipulate rather than enable, that strength means independence rather than codependence makes it difficult to recognize when vulnerability is weaponized and empathy is exploited. But perhaps the most important lesson from our relationship is understanding the difference between helping someone heal and enabling someone to avoid the discomfort that healing requires. My comprehensive support allowed Lily to maintain her dysfunction while avoiding the difficult work of developing independence, coping skills, and emotional regulation that recovery actually demands. True healing would have required Lily to face her anxiety, practice independence, and develop relationships that didn't depend on one person providing total emotional availability. My willingness to serve as her complete support system prevented that healing by making avoidance comfortable and dependency sustainable. The safe place I tried to create was actually a cocoon that prevented growth rather than protected healing. Lily needed to experience manageable amounts of discomfort, uncertainty, and independence to develop the skills necessary for healthy adult relationships. My protection from those experiences delayed her development rather than facilitating it. Her eventual accusation that I was controlling was actually a necessary part of her individuation process, a way of creating the separation and autonomy that healthy development requires. But instead of acknowledging that she had been dependent and needed to become independent, she reframed the dynamic as escaping control rather than accepting responsibility. The professional success Lily achieved by positioning herself as an expert on emotional abuse was real and meaningful, but it was built on a foundation of projection and reversal that allowed her to avoid examining her own capacity for manipulation and control. Her insights about abuse dynamics were accurate precisely because she had employed those dynamics, but acknowledging that would have complicated her victim narrative. I've learned to recognize that some people's healing requires others to be designated as the source of their problems, that recovery sometimes demands villains who can be overcome rather than helpers who can be thanked. Lily needed me to be controlling so she could practice being independent, needed me to be manipulative so she could develop resistance to manipulation. The friends who chose to believe Lily's version of our relationship made understandable choices based on incomplete information and cultural assumptions about abuse dynamics. Supporting someone who claims to be escaping emotional abuse feels morally clear in ways that examining complex codependent relationships does not. But the cost of that moral clarity was perpetuating a narrative that obscured rather than illuminated the actual dynamics that had made our relationship unhealthy for both of us. Lily's manipulation wasn't acknowledged, my victimization wasn't recognized, and the lessons that might have been learned about enabling versus helping were lost in the simplistic framework of abuser and victim. Dating has remained complicated by the reputation Lily created, but I've learned to see those complications as protection rather than persecution. Women who immediately assume I'm controlling based on unverified allegations probably aren't capable of the nuanced thinking that healthy relationships require anyway. The few serious relationships I've developed since then have been with people who could distinguish between someone describing controlling behavior and someone actually exhibiting it, who could see that my awareness of manipulation tactics came from having been manipulated rather than from having been manipulative. My professional life has stabilized around people who know me well enough to distinguish between reputation and reality, who can see that my understanding of unhealthy relationship dynamics comes from having survived them rather than having created them. But the most important change has been learning to recognize when someone's need for safety is actually need for control, when requests for support are actually demands for submission, when vulnerability is being weaponized rather than shared. The signs are subtle but consistent: the gradual isolation from other relationships, the monopolization of time and energy, the weaponization of mental health language to avoid accountability. The safe place I tried to create for Lily became a prison for both of us. She was trapped in dependency that prevented growth, and I was trapped in caretaking that prevented living. Her escape required making me the enemy, but my escape required recognizing that love without boundaries becomes imprisonment for everyone involved. Some people need to make their helpers into their enemies to become the heroes of their own stories. Understanding that pattern doesn't make it less painful, but it makes it less confusing. Lily's rewriting of our history wasn't about truth, it was about healing that required someone else to be the wound she had overcome. The woman who once whispered that I was her safe place had to make me dangerous to feel safe with herself. That inversion was necessary for her growth, even if it was devastating for my reputation. Sometimes being someone's safe place means accepting that they'll eventually need to escape from the safety you provided to find the strength they always possessed.